pleased to announce our first speaker, who's a tireless campaigner against austerity, Owen Jones.
Friends, good morning. I've very rudely got to leg it literally in a few minutes, so the blessing is you won't have to listen to me babbling for very long. It's great to be here, and I guess I'd start by asking what we're all doing here on a Saturday morning, some probably more bleary-eyed than others. And there'll be lots of different reasons. I think many of us will have lots of different things that dragged us out of bed today to come here in North London with other like-minded people. I suppose one reason which is so compelling at the moment, and I think lots of people in this room, I think it would have hit home, is something which happened a few hundred miles north. And of course that was in Grangemouth, near Falkirk, funnily enough, a city I used to live in, as you can tell from my penetrable Scottish accent. And I think there was a lesson that came out of Grangemouth. And it is a lesson about modern Britain, where we ask this: where a bullying billionaire tax exile can hold to ransom not just hundreds of workers and their families, not just an entire community, but an entire country from the comfort of his £130 million yacht. And that is a reality of modern Britain. The age-old question, who runs the country? And I think something else recently hammered that home as well. When Ed Miliband proposed, by what I think by most historic standards, was a pretty timid, pretty moderate policy in lots of ways, a temporary freeze on energy prices at a time when elderly people are going to literally freeze to death in their homes. And the response was the sort of rhetoric many people might have thought was better placed in 1950s America, in some of the speeches of Joseph McCarthy, of Marxism, of Reds under the bed, socialism, and so on. And yet, of course, it was a policy which, if you look at the polls, was more moderate than what most of the British people want, given, according to the polls, nearly 7 out of 10 Britons want our energy supply out of the control of the Big Six and those bullies, and in the control of the British people. But it was a lesson there as well, because what it showed is those at the top are so drunk on 3 decades of free market triumphalism, so used to wealth and power being shoveled in their direction by government after government, that even a slight deviation of that path is greeted with mass hysteria from Fleet Street and politicians of the right. And I think that is a story which explains in large part why this movement is so important. Because we are now going through the longest fall in living standards since Queen Victoria sat on the throne of this country. And when we hear about the Tories at the moment, again in triumphalist mode, when everything they promised, every measure of austerity has failed, even on its own terms, whether it be debt, they said they'd pay off the debt, they're going to add more debt in 5 years than Labour did in 13. Whether it be the deficit, they said they'd wipe out in one parliament when the underlying deficit grew last year. Whether it be growth. This is the worst so-called economic recovery. Not since the 80s, not since the 70s, not even since the Great Depression of the 1930s. This is the worst so-called economic recovery in the history of modern Britain. And it seems almost as though their strategy was to sock as much growth as they could in the first few years, so anything after that looks like a miracle. But the reality is they're building a Britain of food banks, of legal loan sharks, of 0-hour contracts. But of course it is recovery for some. So recovery for the hedge funds, the banks, the legal loan sharks who bankroll the Conservative Party, for whom the Conservative Party exists to serve, and who they have done so ably over the last few decades. And that's where we've got to come in. We've got to go out there and give people hope. Because there's lots of anger and lots of fear, lots of desperation, but hope is missing. And that's why we have to build a broad movement that articulates many of the issues, the everyday issues that affect people, and give people answers. The fact we should be building housing, letting councils build housing, instead of lining the pockets of landlords with housing benefit. That we should have a living wage rather than literally subsidising poverty wages with tax credits, that we will look back in horror one day at the idea you could get up in the morning, slog your guts out and come home with a pay packet that doesn't allow you to look after yourself, let alone your children, about creating hundreds of thousands of renewable energy jobs to take on the environmental and the jobs crisis, to demand that we have public ownership of the banks we the people bailed out, about an all-out offensive against tax avoidance, to force the likes of Amazon, Google, Sir Philip Green to pay taxes they so far refuse to do, to bring back into public ownership the likes of the railways, which we spend 4 times more of our money subsidising than in the days of British Rail, and of course energy and so on. These are popular policies, they're mainstream policies. But the point is this: if we don't act now, if we don't put aside differences and go all about people's front of Judea, which so far we've managed to avoid doing commendably, if we build an alliance of those in the Labour Party, the Green Party, no political home, of unions representing millions of private and public sector workers, of campaigners for disabled people, young people, unemployed people, for tax justice and so on, we can build a formidable coalition that forces those at the top to listen. And that's how I'd end. When we think of this day of national civil disobedience and protest, we remember this: everything we have won, all the gains, all the rights, were not won through the goodwill and generosity of those above, but through ordinary people from below organising, uniting together, forcing those with power to listen, those who fought for workers' rights, for women's rights, against sexism, racism, homophobia. Everything we have won, and everything now which faces being stripped away from us. This country and everything we have, built by our mothers and our fathers, our grandmothers and our grandfathers and our ancestors before them. We truly stand on the shoulders of giants, and we draw from inspiration the fact in the past when people got out there and fought, whether it be for women's rights, whether it be against the poll tax, whether it be UK Uncut, forcing tax avoidance on the agenda. It is possible to get out there and to win. So let's not come here to let off a bit of steam, to have a therapy session almost where we share how bleak and awful things are. Let's think proactively today about how we can get the initiative, about how we can fight back, and above all, win. We stand together, we fight together, we will win this battle together.